This set the stage for the presidential election of 1952, in which Dwight D. Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, as well as the American mastermind behind D-Day, promised to extricate the United States from the Korean War if he was elected, and this he did. And 1953, in many ways, was somewhat of a false dawn for the Cold War. In that year, the Korean War was ended, not officially. There's still, in fact, a state of war on the Korean Peninsula. It was merely an armistice. But also, 1953 saw the death of Joseph Stalin, and there were hopes on both sides that there would be somewhat of a relaxation of tensions because of these two events. Eisenhower, who had come to the conclusion with himself that nuclear war must never be fought and never could be and could never be won, sought to wage the Cold War in such a way as to prevent the onset of a war, particularly in Europe, but also in Asia, between capitalist and communist forces. And he went about his peace efforts by prioritizing military force at the highest and lowest levels of American capability. At the highest levels, this was encapsulated by a policy of massive retaliation, where American statesmen, Dwight D. Eisenhower, but also his Secretary of State, describe nuclear weapons as, in fact, just another bullet in the clip, in an attempt to signal to adversaries everywhere that the United States would respond very actively and powerfully to threats anywhere that their interests were at stake. At the lower levels, this was seen in a prioritization during the Eisenhower years on covert ops, especially in the global south. In operations in Iran, Guatemala, and the Congo, U.S. forces, often guided by CIA outposts there, worked assiduously to help leaders that they saw as counterweights to communist forces there to overthrow various leaders and regimes that were seen as too friendly to the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration thus dealt with two very different challenges during his presidency. The first being the continuing presence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. This was seen in 1956 when Hungary attempted to exert somewhat more independence from its Soviet backers. At the time, the government in Hungary described this as socialism with the human face and found its attempts at reform crushed under the weight of Soviet and Warsaw Pact tanks. But Eisenhower also had to deal with a world that was rapidly changing around him. And this was really centered on the process of decolonization that was picking up, that was accelerating quickly at this time. This is perhaps best exemplified by the situation in Vietnam, where French forces found themselves besieged at their outpost of Dien Bien Phu, and the United States was faced with the prospect of a Western ally losing a key source of, losing a key political territory at a moment of concern about the spread of communism in Asia in particular. Simultaneously, however, in Suez in the Middle East, the Eisenhower administration found itself faced with allies who were willing to go beyond what America saw as permissible by, in this case, invading the Suez in an attempt to reassert control over the vital Suez Canal. And on this occasion, the British and the French and the Israelis, under somewhat false pretenses, invaded the sovereign territory of Egypt. And here, surprisingly, the two superpowers, although antagonistic, found themselves on the same side. And the Soviet Union and the United States actually exerted pressure on each of these invading powers to draw back their forces and settle the conflict there. So the Eisenhower administration found itself in some ways pursuing a very ambiguous policy. In some cases in Vietnam, it sought to support a Western ally in continuing control over a colonial populace, and in fact began to move more of its forces as well as its investment toward the South Vietnamese regime. But it also found elsewhere that it needed to find a way to work with these post-colonial states, now that it was increasingly apparent that the age of imperialism had come to an end. Now, the final element to understand about the Eisenhower period was the certain technological advances, particularly technological advances that changed the character of the nuclear arms race and the nuclear standoff substantially. The first of these was the launch of the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, which caused quite a controversy in the United States. This period also witnessed the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which for the first time allowed an adversary to threaten the American mainland. And finally, the inability of the Eisenhower administration to pursue arms control or detente with their Soviet counterparts. As a result, for the election of 1960, the Democratic candidate, John F. Kennedy, presented a United States that was in fact losing the arms race, that a missile gap had developed between the Soviet Union and the United States. In fact, this was false. The United States still had an advantage in nuclear weapons as well as delivery vehicles that range between 5 to 10 times the amount that the Soviet Union could itself field. But there were other targets, other processes that were beginning to open up a bit of a window of opportunity, but also danger between the United States and the Soviet Union. The first was the Sino-Soviet split, which began to manifest itself around 1960 as the two communist giants found themselves more and more at odds over the direction of the communist movement. The Kennedy administration, when they came into office, therefore sought to introduce more flexibility into American strategy. As opposed to Eisenhower's massive retaliation, they would pursue what was called at the time flexible response, which would allow them to reply to challenges in Europe or on the Cold War periphery with certain graduated military means, ranging from U.S. Special Forces all the way up to the full power of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. It also saw an attempt to develop common ideas with the Soviet Union about what nuclear weapons meant for strategic stability. And here, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was quite crucial in putting forward the notion of mutual assured destruction. The idea being that both sides in the development of their nuclear arsenals could create a situation that would in fact make crises more easy to weather and would allow them to would create an environment in which conflict was less likely. This would be done by pursuing assured second strike capabilities, meaning nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles that could survive a first strike and still respond in such a way and at such a scale that the adversary would be deterred from pursuing the first strike. And the hope was this would create common language as well as a more stable environment for the United States and the Soviet Union to pursue their interests, but also potentially cooperation. However, underneath mutual assured destruction, which its opponents came to label MAD, was the introduction of more and more military advisors in Vietnam. During the Kennedy administration, this reached the levels of 18,000 military advisors, and we see a deepening commitment by the United States to Vietnam, but also other areas in the post-colonial world that the Kennedy administration in particular saw as the most important front in the global Cold War. In this vein, the Kennedy administration supported a coup against the American strongman in Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, whose Catholicism and a lack of inclusivity had alienated Buddhists in the country. But it also had to fend off two major crises that threatened to bring about a third world war. The first took place in the familiar confines of Berlin, where Khrushchev had empowered the East German government to negotiate with West Germany and the Allied powers in the interest of prompting the United States and its NATO allies to come to come to an agreement with Eastern Germany as to the fate of the region. This led to confrontations on the streets of Berlin, Soviet and American tanks facing off against each other at a distance of only 50 to 100 meters against the backdrop of two heavily armed nuclear powers. In the end, Khrushchev backed down, and instead of forcing the NATO alliance to recognize East Germany, built a wall through the heart of Berlin in order to stave off masses of East Germans, East Europeans, and East Berliners who were fleeing to the capitalist world, which was considered quite a black eye for the communist world. Soon after, however, came a crisis that whose potential consequences were so great that in historical hindsight, we often forget how grave the circumstances were the year before in Berlin. And this would be, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Occurring in October of 1962, this took place when Khrushchev placed Soviet medium-range and nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles in Castro's new republic. And thanks to American surveillance capabilities, in particular the U-2 spy plane, the United States discovered the introduction of these weapons. And Kennedy, after almost a week of intense talks with his immediate foreign policy advisors, determined to establish an embargo, basically a blockade around Cuba, in order to prevent more Soviet ships and more Soviet missiles from entering the island. Eventually, Khrushchev backed down. This was facilitated by back-channel talks between the Soviet ambassador and John F. Kennedy's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, through which the United States promised never again to invade Cuba, as well as to secretly, and this was key, remove missiles, the Jupiter missiles themselves, medium-range nuclear weapons, from Turkey in exchange for Soviet promise to remove their missiles from Cuba.